Hi, this is the Shintaido of America podcast. I'm David Franklin. It was a lovely May day, and we sat in the grass on the practice field near the Tama River in Tokyo, writes Michael Thompson. Aoki suggested some meditation and remembering techniques which might enable me to communicate directly with my subconscious. He went on to talk about how everyone is marked by one or more childhood experiences. They might be as seemingly trivial as being left alone at some particularly vulnerable time, but they stay with us all our lives. When he was studying in college, he felt disgust for humanity because he found people so simple and predictable. But later he felt more compassion and was now devoting himself to finding ways to help others de-hypnotize or deprogram themselves in order to unlearn old habits, to grow, and to define their own lives. Master Shintaido instructor Michael Thompson's autobiography, Untying Knots, is full of such episodes of existential unfolding, some disturbing, some lighthearted, all rendered with quiet, dry wit and honesty. That's what I'm going to be reading to you on this, episode 14 of Season 2 of the Shintaido of America podcast, which is what you're listening to, and I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin, so that's who you're listening to, and Shintaido, in case you haven't heard of it, or you've heard of it but aren't very familiar with it. Personally, I've been practicing this truly amazing form of body movement since 1983. It was invented in Japan in the 1960s by a group of artists, actors, and martial artists. It's a dynamic, playful, and creative holistic health exercise. It's great fitness training for all kinds of bodies, and it can be a way to open up to deeper connections with the natural world, within ourselves, and with our communities. No matter your definition of Shintaido, there is no question that it can be intimidating at times, as well as profoundly transformative and rewarding, as you will hear in these chapters of Untying Knots. Untying Knots is Michael Thompson's story of his lifelong encounter with the practice of Shintaido. Michael is one of only 3 master instructors of Shintaido living in the world today, and was instrumental in bringing this discipline to North America, along with Shintaido of America co-founder, the late Haruyoshi F. Ito. And by the way, if you're just joining us on the podcast, you can hear previous chapters of Michael's book. In fact, you can hear all the previous episodes of this podcast, featuring interviews and other audiobooks, at our website, www.shintaido.org. I'll tell you more about that later. But right now, let's jump into Untying Knots. In the previous episode, it's the 1970s, and Michael is being guided on hikes through Japan's Tanzawa Mountains by the expert hiker and somewhat eccentric British Shintaidoist Wendy Laird. He also spends 100 consecutive frosty nights by the Tama River in Tokyo with his comrades, holding wooden swords extended toward the horizon for hours of so-called meditation, and gets advice from his teacher and Shintaido's founder, Hiroyuki Aoki, about leading a Shintaido group, the art of gore, which is intended to mean more than teaching body movement techniques in a simplistic way, but rather should resemble the art of conducting a symphony orchestra. So, with that in mind, here we go. Chapter 21, originally Section 3, Chapter 8 in the printed book, Tohoku Travels. I was starting to get the feeling that my stay in Japan was reaching its conclusion toward the end of my second summer, the usual 2-year cycle again, but I felt that I really hadn't gotten to know the hidden or dark side of Japan that I had heard and read about. I knew that Aoki had recommended a tour of Tohoku, the northern part of Honshu Island, to another Shintaidoist, so I asked him if he had any suggestions. Since I wanted to immerse myself in the untamed or magical side of Japan, I wasn't looking for too much, just some addresses and introductions if possible, which he obligingly provided. In preparation for the trip, I read the poet Basho's Narrow Road to a Far Province, which is a series of haiku poems inspired by his travels, and Tohoku's sketchbook by Philip Williams, who compared the area's nature with Scotland and New England, 2 locations where I have either personal or ancestral roots. These gave me some idea of where I wanted to go and what to look for, but I knew I was not a good traveler. I like a modicum of creature comforts and stability, and that I shouldn't expect my experiences to be as transcendent or transformative as theirs. I needn't have worried. The combination of worrying where I would be going next and self-conscious attempts at having an appropriately deep experience ensured that the trip, while not a total fiasco, was less than successful. Considering the rustic spots I visited, the spectacular natural setting, and the very hospitable people I encountered, it should have been something special. And that was the problem. The more I told myself that such and such a place was spectacular, the less I was able to experience it, and that nagging voice only got louder as the trip wore on. When I finally boarded the train to return to Tokyo, I felt a great sense of relief that the trial was over. This relative euphoria lasted only until the train was slowed during a storm, and I began to fret that I might miss the connecting train to my apartment. So much for getting away from my schedule-oriented life in Tokyo. Although I didn't realize it at the time, this episode reflected unerringly what had been happening to me in Shintaido. I would always get involved in these games of comparison, comparing myself to others, comparing my actual condition with what I hoped or expected to become or thought I should be. With few exceptions, all my experiences were filtered through this fog of self-analysis. Aoki once said he could actually see it when I was furiously trying to think of what to say in some particular situation. I thought it would dissipate if I threw myself into an entirely new and unpredictable situation, but I underestimated the tenacity of my old habits. I'm sure it's not true just in Shintaido, but it seems that by focusing too intently on achieving a goal, whether it be spiritual or personal, we can lose sight of the fact that the goal is present in the process. Aoki used to say that it was a mistake to imagine that satori, or enlightenment, was something that was waiting for you at the end of your path, but rather that it was present in every step. In fact, satori may be manifest in a series of smaller understandings rather than a single grand, eye-opening mega event. Some of my friends and relatives who are or were alcoholics tell me that the rule of thumb is that you can't start to reinvent yourself until you have hit bottom and seen how futile your mental struggling is. I thought I had already learned this lesson, but there was one more defeat to come. You've just been listening to Chapter 21 of Michael Thompson's Untying Knots, and this is the Shintaido of America podcast. I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin. We're about to hear Chapter 22, but before we get to that, I have a favor to ask. It's not what you think. I'm not going to ask you for money or to subscribe to a paid version of the podcast with bonus material or anything like that. Well, actually, I am going to ask you for money later, but right now, that's not important. What's important is, if you're enjoying today's podcast, the most important thing you can do to help out is to tell people about us. I want to give a big shout out. Okay, not that kind of shout. I want to give a big shout out, that is, a big thank you, to those of you who have already shared the podcast on social media, and also to those of you who are going to share it, which I hope means everybody who can hear the sound of my voice. Also, a shout out to people who gave us a good rating on whichever podcasting app you're using. That also helps us a lot. So, if you haven't done that yet, it really doesn't take long. It would be great if you could just hit the pause button and do that right now. Just share the podcast on social media and give us a good rating on your podcast app, and then hit play again. I'll wait.
I'm so thin.
Okay, thanks. On with the show. Chapter 22, which was originally Section 3, Chapter 9 in the printed book. The bigger the mountain, the bigger the shadow. I was on the staff of the Autumn Shintaido workshop in Iwai, Japan, at a beach hotel north of Tokyo. I don't remember exactly what my job was. Usually I was asked to be a coordinator for the foreign attendees, but this time I was involved in the running of the workshop itself. There were 4 of us, 2 Japanese and 2 Americans, and since we were good friends, we were looking forward to running it together. Ito, who was back in Japan for a couple of months, and Ken Waite, at that time the UK's head instructor, were both in attendance, and so it promised to be a reunion of sorts. The first part of the workshop proceeded uneventfully. I had been told by some of the senior people that it was time for me to take my senior instructor examination, since I had been in Japan for 2 years and had been studying Shintaido almost full-time during that period. I got the impression that this was to be more of a ratification than a test. As a result, I didn't give it much thought beforehand, although I slept very poorly the night before and started to produce my nervous skin symptoms, which always seem to occur at critical moments. During the morning practice, we did a long Eiko dai, Eiko being one of Shintaido's signature techniques based on running, extending, and vocalizing, running along the beach with the bow staff. I felt almost totally empty and drained of energy, barely managing to keep from dropping my bow. I hadn't had that feeling for over 2 years, since the last practice with Ito in San Francisco, to be exact. When it came time to present myself for the exam, I was still thinking about that Eiko. I was asked to do some basic exercises in addition to a bow kata I had recently learned. I could tell it was going to be one of those days when the sand would absorb whatever energy I managed to muster, and when it came time to do the partner exercises, I was already fighting for breath and bemoaning my years. Then Aoki, just to add insult to injury, chose Ken Waite to be my partner. He was from the same mold, which could be called thuggish, as Aoki's first students, and had gone on to become a top practitioner of Egami's karate school. Of all the foreigners who were practicing Shintaido, he had the most beautiful form and, with the possible exception of Robert Préant, the strongest technique. When he strode out to start the sparring practice, he looked like Andre the Giant, and I felt like Mr. Peepers, the exceedingly wimpish schoolteacher played by Wally Cox in the early days of television. I think we did 3 separate sparring exercises, culminating with the dreaded Nagewaza throwing techniques that had been my undoing in San Francisco. The only difference was that this time I was never able to regroup my forces and was totally undone. The Japanese have a precise expression for what happened to me, koshi o nuku, which we might translate as having your legs pulled out from under you, but I think it's more like losing your vital force with just the outer shell remaining. At least that's how it felt. After it was all over, I rationalized that I had had an off day and that I would probably pass with an admonition to work on my throwing technique some more. Naturally, Aoki had a different agenda and proceeded not only to fail me, but to point out to me and everyone listening that I had shown a glaring weakness that surprised even him. He said that, although I had a good understanding of Shintaido, my body hadn't quite gotten it. If I was in a comfortable situation where I could use my natural, or rather habitual way of dealing with people and events, I was good. But if it were necessary to receive a strong attack or respond to a hostile encounter, I was very weak. Each of his words seemed to cut the remaining strings that were holding me up. By the time he had finished, I was completely crushed to the point of not even being able to put up a good front for my friends, students, and strangers. The workshop wound down, and we said our goodbyes before heading back to our homes. I stood on a train platform, waiting for the express to Tokyo, feeling demoralized and wondering what I should do next. Should I admit defeat, quit Shintaido, and go on to something else? And I tried to imagine what that something else might be, and what my life would be without Shintaido. My thoughts went back to Beauficelle and one of Marc Bassis's marathon Eiko practices. We were using our bow, and I remember running past Robert and noticing that he was sobbing as he ran. I asked him afterwards if he had been in pain, and he said that as he was running, he started to think about stopping his practice of Shintaido, and this had unleashed his torrent of tears. The memory helped me understand that I couldn't quit. For better or for worse, Shintaido had become too much an integral part of my life for me to leave it. Standing on that isolated platform, I really was a stranger in a strange land. I had to make a choice, or at least put all my chips on the table. The French philosopher Blaise Pascal, a contemporary of Descartes, once wrote of the necessity of taking a stand or making a bet with respect to belief in God. I thought that I had reached that point with respect to the efficacy of Shintaido. In his closing remarks, Aoki had made the analogy between Shintaido practice and mountain climbing. He said that as bigger mountains cast bigger shadows, the farther you progress in Shintaido practice, the greater the conflicts between the demands of practice and our character in daily life. Thus, we should expect to face darker shadows as we advance, but we should also be aware that others have faced them previously and try to learn from them. He added that if you feel that you are having a mental problem, it could be a sign that you are about to overcome it. Since I felt that I had been having a mental problem for the past 4 years, I had my doubts about that assessment, but it seemed I had no choice other than to keep going. Hey guys, this is David again with just a quick reminder before we continue. You've just been listening to Chapter 22 of Michael Thompson's book Untying Knots on the Shintaido of America podcast. If you've listened this far, you obviously like the podcast, so share the joy, on social media especially. That's a good way to help people find us. If you're not a big social media user, that's okay. Just email the link to one person who might enjoy it. It's a good way to say hello to your friends. It doesn't cost any money, it doesn't take long, and it will help us a lot. Thanks if you've done it already, and if you're feeling bad because your guilty conscience is nagging you that you haven't done it yet, there's an easy way to solve that problem, which is just to hit the pause button and do it now. Okay, enough with the nagging from your conscience and from me, back to Michael Thompson's Untying Knots. But really, if you like the podcast enough to have listened this far, then promise you're going to do it before you continue listening, okay? That's what the pause button is for. Okay, thanks. On with the show. Chapter 23, originally Section 3, Chapter 10 in the printed book, Time and Tide. I was beginning to feel as if I had been Aoki's grand Shintaido experiment, to see if a middle-aged, stiff, non-martial artist could get it, and that the experiment had failed. Perhaps this had been his final attempt to rouse me from my stupor. I harbored suspicions that he had contributed his energy to Ken's to make my task even more daunting. This was not just paranoia. I had seen, or felt, him do just this in one of the regular Sunday practices in Tokyo. As I remember, we were doing Eiko with our Bokto, which seemed especially heavy that day. Not just myself, but all the participants seemed to be experiencing the subjective feeling of moving through a space where gravity had become twice as heavy. Even before the practice had begun, he had placed himself at a greater distance than usual in the opening sitting and bowing. There is no doubt in my mind that he is capable of using his energy that way, which is why I think of him as a shaman, although I am less sure that he was playing that particular game during my exam. During the following month, I went through many changes of mood and health and was reminded of one of those speeded-up time-lapse films of the sky where clouds and storms succeed each other within seconds. I also had several vivid dreams which seemed to be telling me where I was and what I should be doing. In one of them, I met my mother, who had died 10 years prior, and asked her about my father, who had killed himself when I was 2. She said he had been a proud and frustrated man who, while he did not physically abuse his family, was so unhappy that he was unable to give us any of his love. At some points, the dreams melded with waking images, and I saw him as a severe taskmaster, even with very young children, who insisted that I do something over and over until I got it right, saying to my protesting mother, "It's the only way he'll learn." It was to her that I turned at such moments. Obviously, all my authority figures, past and present, combined to form this male character, but it seemed like an accurate picture of my father, of whom I have no conscious memory. More importantly, it offered an explanation for my weakness in the face of a strong attack. Ito was very solicitous after the workshop and dragged my nearly inert body out of the house to a park in Tokyo's Shinjuku district to work on some of my shortcomings. Ken came along to help, and I practiced my attack technique by trying to fight my way through their blocks and resistance. This practice, and running some long eiko-dai, helped to re-energize me, but I would still suffer relapses of defeatism and self-pity. At one point, Ito himself became discouraged and came down with some kind of flu, which I immediately caught also. The two of us sat in my apartment eating mandarin oranges by the bushel and feeling sorry for ourselves. Finally, Aoki took pity on us and came over to give us one of his famous tough love shiatsu massages, which left both of us groaning in pain but happy. There was a workshop for leaders scheduled for the end of December, which I was supposed to attend, although I hardly felt like the leader of anything. Just before this event, I had had another significant dream in which a certain Reverend Hayakawa, who was in fact a Christian minister and a friend of Aoki's, asked me why I was still leading an ordinary existence when my destiny was to be a missionary. I stammered some lame excuse, but knew that I had strayed from my appointed path. Once again, nature conspired to lend drama to a Shintaido event which took place in the Tokyo suburb of Asamino and was hosted by Shiko and Hideko Hokari, members of the Rakutenkai group that established Shintaido. The weather was as changeable as my life had been for the previous month, and as the group dynamics would be during the retreat. With some exceptions, it was mostly a gathering of the same people who had been with me for my first Japanese workshop, including founding members and experienced martial artists Ito, Hokari, Mitsuru Okada, Masashi Minagawa, and the added presence of Ken Waite and Robert Briand. Once again, I felt out of my league and headed off to the first practice, which, of course, was the dreaded Nagewaza throwing techniques. As I was floundering around, Aoki came over to say, "What I see is okay. The only bad thing is that you think you can't do it." That evening, after a Christmas party, I awoke in the middle of the night, violently ill with vomiting and diarrhea, which lasted throughout the night. I staggered to the morning practice, not expecting to participate, but Aoki invited me to do sumo wrestling practice with him, and I felt reinvigorated by pushing against him to the point where I could join in the extra bo-kata study. I later learned that he had been so discouraged by the tenor of our discussions the previous evening that he himself had lost his spine, the feeling called koshi onuku in Japanese, and had gone out during the night to do sumo exercise with Minagawa to regain his strength. During the meeting that night, I was sitting feverish in a corner, but my mind had suddenly become very alert, and I think I somehow filled the room with a renewed positive feeling, because everyone looked at me and remarked on how filled with healthy life energy I'd become. The following morning, we went out to do the final practice, led by Ito. We were to work on what is called in Japanese irimi, which is the distinguishing characteristic of many techniques that involve moving quickly and directly into your partner's space or universe. When I was dejected, I always had a problem with it, losing the initiative to people I considered bigger, stronger, younger, or otherwise better endowed than I. On the way to the dojo, Aoki asked me how much longer I was planning to stay in Japan, and I answered that it was around 5 months. He said, "I'll give you 5 months to overcome this defeatist feeling. It's your greatest weakness." Another wake-up call, but this one put the fear of God in me because it really was my last chance. During the practice, he noted, "When you think of others, your technique is effective, but when you think only of yourself, it's empty." I think I got a little better as the practice progressed, due in part to the familiarity of the techniques and also to the fact that my focus had changed. Afterwards, we did a little show and tell to help sum up what we had been studying. My partner was Robert. We did a series of attack and receiving partner exercises with the bow staff. In the middle of it, I suddenly was able to receive his attacks effortlessly, leaving him gasping for breath, and I started to laugh. A laugh reminiscent of the one Aoki had lured out of me by yanking my belt a lifetime ago in San Francisco. It was as if a spiritual fever had broken, just as the physical one had the previous evening. Aoki later commented that martial arts techniques shouldn't be practiced with some kind of forced seriousness. They should be fun. Ever since then, I have enjoyed this kind of sparring exercise, although I won't claim that I have never been killed in some of them. I had at least caught a glimpse of what it meant to perform high-level martial arts techniques adequately and had begun the process of freeing myself from a very old and persistent hang-up. Before we wrapped up our meeting, Aoki made some comments, which I will summarize. Some people's character is changeable. They go up and down, and they have to fight every day to keep their spirits up, to be outgoing, bright, etc. We have doubts and depressions which must be overcome regularly. If we think of Shintaido as being only for ourselves, it isn't enough. It must encompass others also and be a sacred offering. This is the message of Tenshin Goso and Kenkain, a Shintaido meditation mudra that translates as offering flowers. But we forget this, and our universe quickly shrinks to our own limited personal dimensions. I hadn't fully realized it before, but it was now clear that the martial arts techniques we studied at more advanced levels were the same as the so-called spiritual ones that had drawn me to Shintaido in the first place, and that they were useful tools even when, or especially when, we meet the enemy and discover that the enemy is us. Hi, David here again. Not to nag you about anything, but I just wanted to fill in some tangential information about the famous quotation, "We have met the enemy and he is us." The quote comes from Walt Kelly Jr.'s comic strip Pogo and is a riff on the quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," which was said by American Naval Commander Commodore Perry fighting against the British during the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813, which incidentally was a catastrophe for the American Indian Confederation of Tecumseh. But the satirical version, the quote from Pogo, was published on the second Earth Day, April 22, 1971, and carries an environmental message. In the strip, two characters, Pogo the possum and Porky the porcupine, tread carefully through their home of wetlands and forest, which turns out to be full of garbage and industrial waste. And, looking at the destruction of the natural environment, and speaking perhaps more as a human than as an animal, Pogo rearranges Commodore Perry's famous line and comments, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Of course, in Untying Knots, Michael, who I believe is a fan of the Pogo comic strip, repurposed the quote to encompass a more psychological dimension. And so, back to Untying Knots. Chapter 24, originally Section 3, Chapter 11 in the printed book, Last Eiko in Tokyo. Directly after this retreat, we welcomed in the new year, 1982, at a workshop in Iwai again. This and subsequent events are largely a blur in my mind, since I was in the process of preparing to leave the Japanese dimension and return to the United States. Most of my free time was spent trying to figure out what had happened. I was beginning to feel more comfortable with my role as Shintaido leader and assumed commensurate duties as they were assigned. I was reminded that, although I had overcome my major weakness, there was still a slew of bad habits to contend with, any of which, like an unattended dental cavity, could cause a lot of pain down the road. In fact, Aoki later advised me that, in the future, I might look back on my current state of unlimited freedom and wonder what I saw in it. I had made a lot of friends during my stay, and it was going to be difficult to say goodbye to them. I had been teaching English to the owner of a small coffee shop called the Mellow Yellow and to some of the regular patrons. For some reason, they had adopted me as their resident American, and, in one of the highlights of my stay, took me to see a sumo wrestling dojo, where I met the reigning yokozuna, or grand champion, named Chiyonofuji. In addition, I had befriended another coffee shop owner, and she offered to host a goodbye party for me. Fellow Shintaidoist Ellen Solot helped to organize the event, and we tried to invite as many of my students, friends, and colleagues as we could. It turned out to be a very touching farewell, and I still have a notebook filled with the parting wishes of my Japanese friends. Aoki was not quite through with me, however, and we arranged to meet in the morning before my departure on the practice field near the Tama River. It was a lovely May day, and we sat in the grass. He suggested some meditation and remembering techniques which might enable me to communicate directly with my subconscious. He went on to talk about how everyone is marked by one or more childhood experiences. They might be as seemingly trivial as being left alone at some particularly vulnerable time, but they stay with us all our lives. When he was in college, he felt disgust for humanity because he found people to be so simple and predictable. But later he felt more compassion and was now devoting himself to finding ways to help others de-hypnotize or deprogram themselves in order to unlearn old habits, to grow, and to define their own lives. During this discourse, I found myself yawning and drifting, unironically, into a near-hypnotic state. I don't know if he was doing it to me or if it was the combination of the May morning and my own fatigue. At one of the Tokyo practices he taught, he had led us in standing meditation while he suggested that we could form a positive and pure image of our own beings, though he was always careful to offer such images voluntarily rather than implanting such suggestions directly. He assigned me to do eiko that morning with the remark that I might regress to childhood during the exercise, and in case I felt like crying for my parents or anyone else, to go ahead and feel free to do so. In a kind of stupor, I headed for the open field and began to run the eiko exercise. The space was a little cramped, so I was obliged to make round trips of about 200 yards. I can't say how long I repeated this cycle. Aoki had apparently fallen asleep where we had been sitting, so I figured I would just keep going until he woke up and told me to stop. As I ran repeatedly, my mind cleared, and through its usual chatty self, gradually another mind emerged that seemed to be watching the whole thing with silent, detached amusement. After a long time, I observed a child present in my consciousness. There was no desire to cry or scream. He was more interested in observing the flowers and other sights along the way than anything else. Running eiko became a kind of aimless meandering through the field on the river bank. The main image that came to mind was one of those slightly tipsy Roman nature deities. Another was the peace-loving bull, Ferdinand, from one of my favorite childhood storybooks. A man walking nearby came over to ask me what I was doing, and I think I said Shintaido, which may not have satisfied him, but he must have noticed that I was in no state to carry on a coherent conversation. I finally looked over at Aoki to see if it was over, but he seemed to still be asleep. I couldn't see starting up again, so I went over to wake him up. He sat up, a little disoriented, and asked me how it had gone. I said, "Fine, but my stomach hurt a little." It turned out he was fasting at the time, although I can't say whether there was any connection. One thing was obvious. I had been at it for quite a while, because the side of his face exposed to the sun was completely sunburned, giving it the appearance of a mask, which is white on one side and black on the other. The next morning, I called from the airport to thank him, and he said that I had found my original being, and that everything else was junk. If you start from that point, you'll be all right. I got on the plane to San Francisco. This This is the Shintaido of America podcast. You've just been listening to chapters 23 and 24 of Michael Thompson's book, Untying Knots, and I'm Shintaido instructor David Franklin. We're nearly done, but be sure to listen through to the end of the credits for the cherry. Before the cherry and before the credits, I'm going to pass the hat around among you who are hearing the sound of my voice and do a bit of busking here on the information superhighway. This is the part where I not only nag you again about sharing the podcast on social media, please, and thank you if you already have done so, thank you. I also ask you for money. Shintaido of America, the producer of this podcast, is a totally member-supported nonprofit organization without any corporate sponsorship. There are no ads on the podcast. There are no large grants from big foundations. There's just you, the listeners, the people. And there are many ways to support our truly micro-budget production of educational materials, and I really mean that. We produce a huge amount of content on volunteer power, but some things just require a few bucks in the bank. So, one way is to make a one-time donation in any amount, or another way is to become a member of Shintaido of America for a mere $60 per year if you're hearing this in 2024. That's just $5 per month, and if you can afford that, it would mean a great deal to our hardworking team. You can do that and sign up for our free email newsletter and also find all kinds of free educational resources at our website, where you can also find all the previous episodes of this podcast, which is www.shintaido.org. That's www.shintaido.org. That's whiskey.Sierra Hotel India November Tango Alpha India Delta Oscar Romeo Golf. Got it? Our email address is podcast@shintaido.org, and you can also find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube by searching for Shintaido of America. Stand by for the cherry, but first I want to say thanks for listening to the Shintaido of America podcast. Our episode today was recorded and edited by me, David Franklin, with support from Sarah Baker, Connie Borden, Teresa Soldatova, Jim Sterling, the Joe Zawilski Memorial Fund, and of course, the members of Shintaido of America. Thank you. Contents of this podcast, copyright Shintaido of America 2024, with the exception of a short excerpt from Flower Dance, Traditional Music of Japan, which was included for educational purposes, and guitar effects by me, David Franklin. And here's the cherry. I was fortunate to be studying Shintaido in Japan in the early 1980s when Aoki sensei began to introduce the new Bojutsu program using the 6-foot quarterstaff. My understanding was that Aoki was disappointed that the style of physical movement he had developed in the core Shintaido program was not being translated into Bojutsu, where the movements remained quite stiff and rough. He told us that it was totally anachronistic to try to learn to use the bow as a weapon at the end of the 20th century. From that point on, instead of whacking each other with the bow, we began to throw the bow in the air. We would balance them, play catch with a partner, or do dance-like movements, alternately leading and following a partner. The ultimate goal was to establish unification, even intimacy, with the bow. In this way, we finally learned to regard the bow as a tool with which we could achieve greater flexibility in our bodies and minds, rather than as a weapon that had lost all connection to everyday life. But I felt that this approach was not essentially different from the way I had begun my own practice. It was just more efficient and more fun, I admit. That was an excerpt from Michael Thompson's introduction to the book Total Stick Fighting, Shintaido Bojutsu by Hiroyuki Aoki, published by Kodansha International in 2000, translated into English by Lee Ordman with help from Toshimitsu Ishii, Tomoko Oka, and Taro Aoki. Shintaido, Opening to Life.